So here's a wild irony. I was raised Mormon, where I was taught that monogamy was the only way, the only righteous way to love. And yet our history, especially our spiritual history, is very much rooted in polygamy. As a therapist, I work with a lot of people who've left Mormonism and are starting to deconstruct not just their faith, but their relationships. And one of the biggest things we bump into, well, that monogamy was not necessarily a choice, but more a legacy. I, like many of you, was raised in a high-demand religion that had a lot to say about marriage, sex, and relationships. I'm the sex Mormon therapist with the emphasis on X. I'm a certified sex therapist here to help you get the information we never got at church, unlearn the shame we did, and reconnect with your pleasure. Make sure to subscribe if you're looking for real talk and tips and tricks to better sex and relationships. Okay, let's start by naming the historical context. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, introduced polygamy to the folks who were following the birthing of this new religion, but only in secret and only to certain people of certain standing. And right off the bat, it was controversial and shrouded in issues with power and consent. Over time, as the LDS people moved to Utah, Brigham Young definitely institutionalized polygamy. Women were often sealed to men, which means, in a sense, married to them in deeply imbalanced ways, sometimes without full consent, sometimes as teenagers, and often, if not always, in what I would call spiritual coercion, meaning that if you don't do this thing, you're not going to be able to gain favor with the Lord. And who better to decide who gains favor with the Lord than a prophet or ecclesiastical leader who runs religions. Even though the mainstream LDS Church officially ended polygamy in 1890, the theological residue never left and lives on with us today. We were taught monogamy here on earth, but in the next life, men can still have multiple wives. We call this concept eternal marriage. But for women, it often feels like eternal submission. And what does this do to your psyche, your body, your understanding of love? For those of you who want a deeper dive, I highly recommend the book called The Ghost of Polygamy by Carolyn Pearson, who actually interviews mainstream LDS women and some men about the impact of these beliefs as to how they actually affect their current monogamous relationships. As a therapist, I see the ripple effects of this all the time. Women are carrying deep programming to defer, to serve, and also emotionally and sexually manage their husbands. Men are absorbing an entitlement to emotional, sexual, and spiritual obedience from their wives. Jealousy was often framed as weakness, with sister wives idealized as a sign of righteous sacrifice. These are not neutral teachings. They show up in sexual shame, difficulty asserting needs, and trauma around autonomy and consent. I am a big believer that the Mormon people carry deep intergenerational wounds that still affect them from the legacy of non-healthy polygamy based on coercive versus sexual health principles. Even for those who've left the church, these internalized roles can linger. I hear from many that will say, I'm monogamous, but not necessarily by choice, and I'm afraid to name my curiosity about other relationship structures because I was taught that anything around this arena is dangerous, including my own desire and natural inclinations. Growing up in Mormonism, monogamy wasn't just a relationship style, it was a moral mandate. One man, one woman, forever, your worthiness, your eternal future, your sexual purity, your value. It's all hinged on being a very specific kind of spouse, also playing very specific gender roles as either a woman or a man. I was explicitly taught that if you loved someone, you would never desire anyone else. And that jealousy, in a way, had a holy stamp of approval in the sense of it being used as a tool that would tune you into the very careful monitoring I was supposed to be doing to make sure my husband was keeping his covenants of only ever being interested or sexually turned on by me, while also having to deal with jealousy from this perspective of not having that be an appropriate emotion when I have to think of potentially my husband being married to somebody in the next life. So never mind that everything we know about human sexuality shows that this idea that we would only have one sexual interest and never be attracted to anyone else or have fantasies that would include a wide variety of ideas, including humans. Yeah, everything that we were taught was just super unrealistic and set us up for all kinds of failure when we have this kind of soulmate expectation. Regardless, I was told those things, and I was told that my partner was supposed to fulfill pretty much all of my emotional, spiritual, and sexual needs, and I was to fulfill theirs. This is this is part of what I often refer to as the ownership model. We belong to each other, we own each other, we rely on each other and only each other for many needs. I could talk all day long about the many negative effects these kinds of teachings have on folks, like the propensity of duty, sex, and religious marriages, or big feelings encapsulated in terms like betrayal, trauma, that quite frankly have been hijacked by the fake porn addiction industry, or couples never really being honest with themselves or each other about their sexual desires and fantasies. I oftentimes tease that even though we might get naked on day one of a honeymoon, boy, does it take decades to actually get naked with one another as far as what we're really sexually about. But for today, I'd like to just focus on this very particular twist that hits my religious community in particular, which is when Mormon leaders are doing a lot of tisking about how our sexuality is allowed to be expressed. They are also completely ignoring the historical legacy of polygamy and also the undercurrent that comes with that of ownership, hierarchy, and control, especially over women's sexuality. When I started deconstructing my faith, I didn't go straight to non-monogamy. First, I had to unlearn tons of just basic sexual shame. The idea that I was allowed to have sexual desire, that was normal, did not make me bad or broken somehow, that my body belonged to me instead of to anybody else, that pleasure didn't equal sin, that love didn't have to look like sacrifice and self-erasure, that my desires, my fantasies, and even my above average sexual drive did not mean I was slutty, broken, or needy of male attention. These are all ways that I was sexually shamed on the regular. As a therapist, I started noticing how many clients, especially those coming out of religious systems, were having similar realizations. They weren't trying to blow up their marriages. They were trying to make space for honesty and authenticity. So what does this mean, deconstructing monogamy? This does not mean you have to be non-monogamous. It just means you get curious. You actually give yourself permission to ask the questions, like, why do I believe one person should meet all my needs? Is that what I believe? Is that a realistic belief? Am I choosing monogamy or defaulting to it out of fear or systemic expectations and pressure? What does fidelity mean to me? Is it about sex, or is it about trust? Or is it about transparency? And when we ask questions about what both monogamy and polygamy have meant in our traditions, has it been about mutuality? Has it been about sovereignty and consent? Or has it been about control, hierarchy, and eternal gender roles? For ex-Mormons in particular, monogamy often exists in reaction to polygamy, clinging to maybe the safety of just one partner because more than that maybe feels like chaos, betrayal, or even a return to patriarchal harm, because oftentimes we're conflating non-ethical, spiritually coercive polygamy with the ideas of ethical non-monogamy. But what if neither end of that binary is true? The key really is, are you in a relationship style that aligns with your values or just your programming? And I've supported people through every version of this kind of deconstruction, from people being terrified to ask their partners about non-monogamy, from people navigating jealousy and religious shame side by side, from people learning how to have conversations about desire, maybe for the first time ever. And what I've seen is that when people feel safe enough to question the scripts they were given, that's when they start to reclaim their truth. So non-monogamy isn't about a relationship style that's better or even more evolved. It's definitely not the answer for everyone, but the freedom to ask the question, that's what healing looks like. Healing looks like giving yourself permission to question what you were taught, to give yourself permission to untangle love from obedience, to be able to recognize that jealousy, ownership, and fear are not the same as being committed to another person, and making space to explore your values, not just your vows. Sometimes people stay monogamous with a lot more intention. Sometimes people explore ethical non-monogamy with more honesty. Sometimes people part ways because they realize that the structure for which they got married isn't necessarily the structure that they're in now that they have a chance to choose. But regardless of which way you go, you're not reenacting church history when you deconstruct. You're reclaiming your story. If you were raised Mormon, your relationship to monogamy did not start with you. And I would say that is true of any of us who were raised religious. It was shaped by prophets, patriarchy, government, and the promise of eternity. But now you get to decide. I'd love to hear, what were you taught about monogamy? Maybe polygamy, if that happened to be your background. How are you deconstructing those messages now? If you were raised in a different religious tradition from Mormonism, what's your legacy of relational scripts that were passed down to you? Subscribe if this resonates, and remember, your relationship style doesn't define your worth, but your freedom to choose it, that's pretty sacred. If you enjoy my content and want to go deeper, go sign up for my newsletter at natashahelfer.com. You'll get a free copy of my current download full of juicy information. And remember to ring my bell and subscribe. I give you full consent.